If you just got the Fujifilm X-T50 and you want to get started taking pictures right away, I wanted to spend some time in this video going through what I think are some of the more important settings to get set up first before you start creating pictures. We're not going to go over all of the menu settings here. We do that in my Fujifilm X-T50 tutorial course, which you can find at photocourses.link/X-T50 and get 20% off of that course with the code TUBE20. But what I want to do in this video, like I said, just cover some of the more important things to get set up first across all of the menus. So get these set up and then you can start creating pictures and playing around with all of the other settings. These are also just my own personal recommendations based on my experience with these cameras. Your needs may be slightly different, but I do at least think you should consider setting these menu settings, again, however you want, or if you want to follow my recommendations. Before you do go through these menus, you want to make sure that that auto selector lever on the shutter speed dial is not in auto. Flip it so it's pointed towards that little dot and not auto. Because if it is in auto, you may find that a lot of these menu settings are inaccessible. So take that out of auto. Let's go through all the menus and get your X-T50 set up so you can start creating some photographs.
We are going to start in the image quality setting menu. So from shooting mode, press menu, and that should be the first thing that comes up unless you are in a different menu first. This menu controls how your image will be processed and then recorded to the memory card. So we're going to start with image size, which is only going to affect your JPEG or HEIF file. I prefer the 3:2 aspect ratio. That's the original aspect ratio of the sensor. It'll record the entire sensor, and then I can crop the image later if I need to. But this is what all of your other options will look like. 3:2 is the native sensor resolution. And then for the size, medium is more than enough if your JPEGs are going to be going to the web or social media. In fact, if you're just going to be posting directly to social media, you can get away with small. That's still going to be more than large enough to post to social media. I'd really only recommend recording large here if you are not recording the RAW file, so you at least have the original resolution of the sensor. For image quality, your options here are to record either just the JPEG, that's fine or normal, record just the RAW format, or the RAW plus the JPEG format. I like to record fine plus RAW. That's going to give me both a high quality JPEG processed file and the original RAW file. I try to get my images perfect in the camera, so I have perfect or close to perfect JPEGs. But I also have the option to reprocess that RAW file later on if I need to. If I'm doing commissioned work, RAW files are nearly always a necessity for that kind of work. Speaking of the RAW file, for RAW recording, lossless compressed will give you a RAW file that is compressed using Fujifilm's RAW compression algorithm. It'll give you a file size that's about half as large as uncompressed, so you can fit more of them in the memory card, but you don't lose any data doing so. Just note that some file browsers, like Mac Finder, cannot extract the thumbnail preview to show you in your computer's file browser. I would much rather have smaller file sizes. In Select JPEG HEIF, I would recommend you set JPEG. Yes, HEIF files are smaller than JPEGs, they have a higher tonal range, they're higher quality, but not all devices can display HEIF files yet, so there is some compatibility issues here. If you want your photos to be universal, to be able to be shown on all kinds of smartphones, computers, set JPEG here. The rest of the image quality settings here, they're all about styling your JPEG photo. I'll have some links in the video where you can read more about these settings. I also did just publish an ebook, an image quality settings guide that you can download for free, and you'll find that link in the video description. This goes through all of the image quality settings, examples of what each one does, and some recommendations and tips for using them. Towards the end of the menu, you'll find the lens modulation optimizer. I would recommend keeping this on so that the camera can fix known lens characteristics for the lens that you have attached to the camera, like distortion and aberrations. Those will be automatically fixed. Looking at color space, I would recommend you set sRGB to ensure that your colors are accurate across all display devices. It's kind of similar to that JPEG HEIF consideration. sRGB is universal. You should only choose Adobe RGB if you're doing color managed printing of your JPEG or HEIF files straight out of the camera. That's really the only time that Adobe RGB is useful here. You'll notice that your colors may look different if you have Adobe RGB set. And just note that this setting will not affect the RAW file. Your RAW file does not have a color space, so you do have the option of changing that when you're processing and exporting your RAW file. Now going on to the AF/MF setting menu. We're going to look at what I would consider your base focus settings and get those set right here. For AF mode, I would recommend choosing all. That's going to let you cycle through all of the available AF modes and sizes, like single point, zone, wide, and tracking, just by pushing the joystick in and then rotating the command dial. It's a really fast way of changing your focus size without having to go into the menus. This does require a specific focus lever setting that we'll look at in a few minutes. Related to that is the AF mode all setting. This is a new feature in the X-T50. Because I recommended setting all in the previous setting, you're going to have a lot of different autofocus modes and sizes to scroll through when you're trying to pick one using the command dial. And since you probably don't need or want all of those different sizes, you can disable the ones that you don't want here. For example, in AFS mode, I don't need 6 single point sizes. So I've disabled everything except for the smallest single point and single point number 5. Now I can much more quickly choose an autofocus size that I want instead of having to scroll through all of them. You can have different AF modes available for both AFS and AFC modes. Store AF mode by orientation I like to have on so that my focus area and positions are saved for both the horizontal and vertical orientations. If I have one setting that I like to use when the camera is in a horizontal orientation, and then a different one for the vertical orientation, as I switch between horizontal and vertical, it will maintain the last used settings for each orientation. AF point display I would recommend keeping off. If you turn that on, you're going to see a grid of focus points on your screen in the wide and zone modes, which can be rather distracting. Moving on to the number of focus points, I personally prefer 117, the smaller number, because that lets me move the focus point around the screen faster than if 425 is set. You may want 425 if your camera is locked down on a tripod and you need to move that focus point in much smaller, more precise adjustments. Otherwise, just set 117 and use the focus and recompose technique. Pre-AF should be off. If you turn this on, your autofocus system is always going to be working, even when you're not commanding autofocus. This is unnecessary with how fast the X-T50's autofocus system is, and it's a huge waste of battery. AF illuminator I would also recommend turning off. This feature turns on the light that's on the front of the camera to help you focus in low light. However, it does have a limited range, and that light can really surprise or blind people if they're not expecting it. They're not going to appreciate that, so keep it off unless you need it. AF plus MF, if turned on, will allow you to refine your focus using the manual focus ring after an autofocus lock has been achieved, which is a nice little feature to have available if you need it. We're not going to go over all of the MF assists, all of the overlays and tools to help you focus manually, but I do just want to mention that we have a video and an article dedicated entirely to those MF assist modes. You can also see more of how to use them in the X-T50 tutorial course. The interlock MF assist and focus ring is another new feature in the X-T50. I keep this on, and what this is going to do is hide the previously mentioned MF assist mode that you set unless you are actively focusing. So that overlay is not going to be on your screen, and then once you turn that focus ring, that overlay is going to pop up to help you focus manually, and then a couple of seconds later, it's going to disappear again. Those overlays can be distracting, so this is a really nice feature to have to be able to hide them until you use them. Focus check should be off. What this is, it's an automatic zoom feature. It's going to zoom in on your focus point as soon as you turn that manual focus ring. It can distract from your composition, and you can also do this manually by pressing the rear command dial. And having that manual control, I think, is much more preferable for most of us. The Instant AF setting will describe how the AF on button behaves when you push it in manual focus mode. I personally prefer AFS so that when I push that AF on button in manual focus mode, it behaves like single autofocus rather than continuous autofocus. The depth of field scale, I'd recommend setting the film format basis, and this is going to allow you to use the zone focusing technique just by guessing your subject distance and make sure that that estimated distance falls somewhere within that blue bar. That pixel basis, I just don't think is accurate enough for much of anything. Under Release Focus Priority, I like to set these to Release for both AFS and AFC. This lets you fully press the shutter button to create a photo even when you do not have a confirmed focus lock. Just note that this does require good shutter discipline, but you may find that you want to be able to press that shutter before the camera has confirmed a lock. The state of that autofocus lock is not going to inhibit you from creating a picture. Touchscreen mode for still photography. This lets you use the touchscreen to control your focus. You can turn it off, or you can set area, which lets you set where the focus area is on the screen. AF will let you use the touchscreen to both set the focus area and command autofocus. Touch shooting, I don't think is very useful. If timing is important, I would recommend not using touch shooting. Let's look at some settings in the shooting setting menu, which again, I think you could consider some base settings and then play around with the rest of them later on. Photometry, you can leave in multi. This is the most practical photometry mode for nearly all situations. I'm in multi more than 99% of the time, using the histogram to adjust my exposures rather than traditional metering. For the shutter type, I like to set the electronic front curtain shutter plus the mechanical shutter. The pure electronic shutter, ES. Yes, it's silent, and you may like the fact that it is silent, but there are a lot of limitations for using the electronic shutter. The electronic front plus mechanical shutter, choosing that's a smart mode where the camera will automatically choose between either the electronic front curtain shutter or the mechanical shutter based on the situation, and that I think gives you the best of both worlds. Flicker reduction, keep that off unless you are photographing under fluorescent lighting and you notice bands or horizontal lines in your photos. Flickerless shutter speed setting. This setting takes effect if you are in shutter priority or manual exposure mode. If you're photographing under fluorescent lighting or LED lighting, and you want to be able to fine-tune your shutter speed to match up with that flickering so you don't see it in your photos, you can fine-tune your shutter speed. When this setting is on, you're going to see your shutter speed in a decimal format on the screen. This throws a lot of people off. I get a lot of emails saying, "Why do I see decimals for my shutter speed?" That's because flickerless shutter speed setting is on. Just want to make sure that you're aware of that. And that is in fractions of a second. IS mode, image stabilization. If you do want to use image stabilization, I'd recommend setting shooting only. That will help you conserve your battery by only activating image stabilization when the shutter is pressed halfway, rather than having it activated all the time. In ISO, that's where you're going to set your ISO setting, but more importantly, you can set up your auto ISO programs. I love using auto ISO in Fujifilm cameras. You can check out a video that I created all about that, linked in the video description. Going into the flash setting menu, one thing here I want to mention is red eye removal. I just like to leave that off because this can cause more problems than it can fix. But if you are using the on-camera flash, you can set this to flash when photographing people and see how it does. We're not going to go into the movie setting menu. We're going to keep this video limited to the still photography settings. That X-T50 tutorial course does cover the movie settings, but if you do just want to set something up to be able to quickly record movies, go ahead and set the movie mode to full HD 16:9, 29.97 frames per second for kind of a standard for casual movie recording settings. Now let's go into the setup menu. There is a lot of options in here, and we're just going to hit the highlights for your X-T50 base setup. Starting in user setting, I would recommend formatting your memory card the first time you use it with the X-T50. That's going to prepare the file structure on that memory card to be used with this camera, and then format it periodically. That's going to help prevent the memory card from becoming corrupted, but be aware that formatting the card does delete everything on the card, so make sure that that's all saved somewhere else first. Set your time zone under area setting and whether or not you're in daylight savings time, which is during the summer months, and then set your actual current date and time so that you have an accurate idea of when your photos were created. I would recommend programming My Menu. It's a great thing to be able to take advantage of. You can watch a separate video dedicated to programming My Menu, linked in the video description. The sound setting menu lets you adjust your sounds, adjust them as necessary. I personally like to keep them all off except for the synthetic electronic shutter sound. Let's go into the screen setting menu and set a few important things up here. In view mode setting, for everyday use, I like the eye sensor for shooting mode, and in playback, LCD only. And what these settings are going to do is, in shooting mode, that LCD is always going to be on, so you can use the LCD. But then when you put the camera up to your face to use the EVF, that LCD is going to turn off and the EVF is going to turn back on. In playback mode, when you're reviewing your images, the LCD is always going to be used. For EVF brightness, Auto does a really good job of adjusting the brightness to match the ambient light. For LCD brightness, 0 is a really good starting point. It'll help you preserve your battery, and you can always turn it up if you need it brighter in bright light. Image display, I would recommend keeping off. If this is set to anything else, the last image that you created is automatically going to pop up on the screen after it's recorded to the memory card. This may tempt you to chimp each photo, to automatically look at the last photo that you created. And when you do that, you could miss some opportunities that are happening in front of you because you're distracted by the last image coming up on your screen. It'll also use up a little bit more battery power. I would just recommend using the play button to review your images when you need to, and only then. Auto rotate displays, keeping this on will help you read your displays when you rotate the camera so they're right side up. Preview exposure and white balance in manual mode. Leave this set to preview exposure and white balance. That's going to show you the effects of your exposure and white balance settings in manual exposure mode. The exception here is if you are working under studio strobe lighting. You're going to want to turn this off so that you can see what you're doing. For natural live view, 2 recommendations here. If you are recording JPEGs and you want to see what your image quality settings are going to do to your final photo, you want to have this off so you can see the effects of those settings. However, if you are only recording the raw file format, you want to see more of what that raw picture is going to look like, then you can turn this on. Framing guideline, I'd recommend setting grid 9. That's kind of like the standard rule of thirds grid. It's going to aid you in composition and framing. Display custom setting is where you can enable or disable certain information from showing on the screen. From the defaults, I would recommend enabling the framing guideline and the histogram. If you want to learn how to use the histogram, you can check out a bunch of other resources that'll be linked in the description. It also has its own dedicated lesson in the Fujifilm Camera Fundamentals course. Going on to the button dial setting menu to set up how our controls work, we're going to look at focus lever setting. Now remember earlier I recommend setting AF mode to all, which allows you to cycle through all of your AF modes just by using the joystick. This is where we need to set that up a certain way. First, for the push function. So if you push that joystick in, I'd recommend setting reset here. And that's going to recenter the focus point to the center of the screen when you push it in. For the tilt function, I would recommend setting that to edit focus area. So you'll tilt the joystick and then you can move your focus point all over the screen and then use the command dial to change the size of that focus area. The function FN setting is where you can customize your camera controls to help you work more efficiently with the camera. There are so many different ways that you could set this up. Just in the beginning, however, if you do want to see what all of the controls do, you can come in here to check that out. There's a shortcut to getting to the screen from shooting mode. If you press and hold the display back button, it's going to automatically pull up this submenu. Shutter AF stands for Shutter Autofocus. The defaults are on for both AFS and AFC, which means that when you press the shutter button halfway, autofocus is going to start. So that shutter button is tied to your autofocus. However, if you want to use the back button focus technique, so you're only focusing with that AF on button, then you can turn this off for the respective autofocus mode. Like you may want to just use back button focus for single shot autofocus, but have the shutter autofocus for AFC, continuous autofocus. Shutter AE, using the shutter to lock the exposure. This is on by default. That's going to lock in any kind of automatic exposure variables when you press the shutter halfway, so your exposure doesn't change. However, if you are going to be in AFC, continuous autofocus, tracking moving objects across changing lighting, you may want to turn this off so that the automatic exposure can catch up to those changing lighting situations. Shoot without lens needs to be on if you are using a third-party lens or a mount adapter. Shoot without card, I recommend turning this off. That'll give you a good extra notification that you don't have a memory card installed. Shutter release will be inhibited. I need this because sometimes I forget to put memory cards back on the camera and the camera says, "Hey dummy, you can't take any pictures right now." AEAF lock mode, if you're going to be using the auto exposure lock button, I would recommend setting this to when pressing so that that exposure is locked when you're holding down the AEL button and only when you're holding it down. So you can release it and then unlock that exposure. For AWB lock mode, I prefer the opposite. I prefer to use this as an on-off switch so that I can press it, lock in my auto white balance, have those consistent colors for whatever lighting situation that I'm in, and then press it again to unlock it and go back to regular auto white balance. Aperture ring setting A tells the camera what to do when the lens aperture control is set to A for automatic, and I would recommend setting automatic to give you automatic aperture control when that lens aperture is set to A. Sometimes it's nice to have full automatic aperture. Or you can set command if you want to use the command dial instead of the aperture ring to set your lens aperture. Aperture setting is only going to be available if you have a lens attached to the camera that does not have an aperture control ring. Set this to auto plus manual to give you the most versatility in using the command dial to change your aperture. Going into the power management menu, auto power off, set it to 1, 2, or 5 minutes. That's going to put the camera into standby mode after that set period of time. You can always wake up the camera by pressing the shutter halfway, and that's going to help you save or extend your battery life. Same thing with performance. I just recommend setting normal for everyday photography. That performance in normal is still really good, and it's going to help you extend your battery. Going into the Save Data setting menu, for frame number, I'd recommend setting continuous. This is going to preserve the image numbering sequence when a new memory card is inserted. That's going to help you with organization if you are using multiple memory cards. You should set your name and copyright info in the copyright and author fields so that this information is written to every image you create. Wherever those images end up on the internet, your name will be attached to them. You can turn geotagging on if you are using the X app smartphone app and you want to record the location of every image. Just beware of how this location data can be exploited by some bad people. It's happened in the past, so turn this off if that's going to be a concern. Going into the network USB setting, this is going to have all of your connectivity functions. Under Bluetooth smartphone setting, Bluetooth on and off, turn Bluetooth on. That's going to be required if you want to use the X app smartphone app for all of the features that has. You can always turn off all of your wireless settings by turning airplane mode on if you want to extend that battery life some more and not use Bluetooth. Auto image transfer order, I would recommend keeping off. That's going to disable automatic image transfer from your camera to your smartphone. If all of your images are automatically being transferred to your smartphone, that can kill your battery really fast and also quickly fill up the storage on your smartphone. I just prefer to transfer images manually. Smartphone location sync, you can turn this on. That's going to download location data from your smartphone to your camera. But that location data will not be recorded to the images unless geotagging is turned on in that Save Data setting menu. Resize image for smartphone is a good one to have on. That's going to downsize your pictures before sending them to your smartphone, which is what I'd recommend for most situations. That's going to speed up the transfer to your smartphone. Your camera is still going to have the full-size image. That downsized image is still going to be plenty big for sharing to social media. Connection mode, set that to USB card reader for now. That's going to let you transfer images directly from your camera to your computer via a USB-C cable. The other options here are for using XRAW Studio and other special features. You can leave USB power supply COM settings set to auto. That's going to allow simultaneous data transfer and charging through USB-C connections. However, if you notice that you have issues transferring data, turn the power supply off. That's going to disable charging when you're connected to a computer, but it may help that data transfer.
So that was a quick rundown of some recommended settings for the X-T50. If you want to learn about all of the menu settings and how to operate this camera, like using the different focus tools and exposure modes and customizing the camera, go ahead and check out the course at photocourses.link/X-T50. Again, use the code TUBE20 for 20% off. Let us know if you have any questions about any of the settings mentioned here, and we'll see you in the next video.